Welcome to the CEO series. Our guest today is Johnny Taylor, President and CEO of SHRM. So glad to have you here. Johnny is the President and CEO of Society of Human Resource Management, the world's largest HR professional society. Prior to joining, he served as President and CEO of the Thurgood Marshall College Fund. He previously held leadership roles at IAC Interactive, New York City. That's where we met. First as Senior Vice President of Human Resources, then as President and CEO of the operating subsidiary. He's the former chairman of SHRM Board of Directors and currently serves on the corporate board of Gallup and on the Board of Trustees of the University of Miami. He holds a JD degree as well as MA from Drake University and bachelor's from University of Miami. He's licensed to practice law in Florida, Illinois, and Washington, D.C. Thank you.
Good to be here. Great to be here, in fact.
Glad you're here. I'm glad you were able to fit this in on your calendar. We've been trying to get this set up for a while, but now we're here and we're talking to Mr. Human Resources, President CEO of SHRM. So let's get started. So let's talk about, from your perch as the CEO of SHRM, where do you see the role in the future of organizations in a kind of a future state?
So, I'm typically very comfortable being a futurist, kind of having an opinion about what the next several years, in fact, the next decade would look like. But I have to be honest, Ron, we have been dealt a blow globally, not just in the United States, but globally, this interesting combination of, the COVID pandemic, right? And it didn't just happen in one part of the country, but globally, right? It literally, for the first time ever, shut the entire world down, essentially. Couple that with, as you all know, a lot of racial unrest and other social issues, but particularly focused on racial unrest and police brutality, racial injustice issues. On top of that, you throw a very acrimonious presidential election year. So you got that going. And then with all of that together, the economy starts to sputter, right? So I was able to, in past, if you had asked me this question a year ago today, I'd roll off what I think was gonna happen.
Yeah.
What we know is that the future is fairly muddy right now. From a work standpoint, there's some things that we're trying to figure out, and I'll let you ask me more. But when you think about remote work, people had an opinion that remote work was going to take off in the pandemic. If you had asked people 4 months ago, they'd say, "Yep, it's going to be the way that people work." Well, I don't know that that's proving to be true. Increasingly, companies are announcing that they see some downsides plural to working remotely. And so they're actually bringing people back to work when they can do so safely. Companies have said, we are going to have people come back to work. So I don't know what the future holds. What I can tell you is that it will be considerably different. Let's put it that way. We know that. And I know some may be sitting saying, well, duh, of course things are different. But I mean, when I say considerably, in some ways that we can't fully comprehend and imagine. Part of it is because we're learning about COVID as we go. This thing is just 7 months or so old in the States in particular. And so what we thought would be the right responses in March, here we are in October suggesting that. I just read an article yesterday where I guess it was the Department of Defense and I'm going to get the school right, one of the colleges and universities, and United Airlines announced that, there's a very, very almost insignificant chance of getting COVID on an airplane. And if you had asked people just 3 months ago, they would have said, absolutely not. So now we're starting to get data that tells us. So what I would have said to you about, well, now post-COVID, people aren't going to travel to meetings. I'm saying, well, the research is suggesting that provided you wear the right mask, et cetera, that your chances of getting COVID on an airplane are slim to none. So I think people will now consider getting back on planes. So that's a long answer. What it means is we as HR professionals have to be incredibly, and business leaders broadly, have to be incredibly flexible and agile. That's probably the number one thing that we walk away from this learning.
Okay. Managers inside of the workplace, leaders inside of the workplace, are you seeing any changes as it relates to leadership competencies of leadership pre-COVID, leadership post-COVID?
Yes, what COVID has done is truly exposed our management problem, especially what I'll call first and second line managers. We've always known that people generally don't quit their company, they quit their manager, right? They have a tough experience, so they don't know the CEO, they don't know the chief marketing officer or the CHRO, but they know and come to work every day and operate with that manager. It's interesting, what COVID has really shined a light for us on is that a number of people who are in management roles don't have the skills, the traits, the qualities and characteristics to be managers. So we have taken, Sally, the engineer, and she was the best engineer and the longest tenured engineer, and we make her the manager of engineers without assessing whether or not she actually has the skills to be a leader and a manager of people. And then even if we determine that she doesn't, without an intervention to help her become a better manager. And so what happens is organizations are losing some of their best talent because we have a manager problem. And so we have this thing that we just launched in response to that called a PMQ, which is a people manager qualification. It's not for HR professionals. It's actually for HR professionals to use within their businesses. It helps them understand where people are on the management continuum. If you're a new manager and you're okay versus you're an experienced manager, not okay. So it's that kind of tool, is to help people get better at people management. Because you're right, this is a big issue for us.
Yeah, huge. So PMQ, how would a professional find out more about that?
Well, go to the SHRM.org, SHRM.org site, and PMQ will be prominently displayed because it's our normally, and you know this, that we have historically certified, trained, produced credentials for HR professionals only. This is the first time it's for HR in the sense that we can focus on more strategic level work instead of fixing up what some manager has screwed up. Employee relations, I can't tell you the number of days I walk in the office and I had a plan, Ron. You've been there where I'm going to work on this big strategic value add, matter. And then someone walks in and says, my manager did X to me. And it derails your entire day. You're doing interviews and investigating and all of that for a week. So you can't get to the high level work that you want to do, that your C-suite values, because you're busy trying to solve for this problem, this PR potential problem. So that's what it's about. But they can go to SHRM.org. It's really taken off too.
Okay, so PMQ, we talked about leaders, first line, second line, being reskilled, new leadership capabilities. What about our profession? I always tell HR people, and I develop people across the globe in HR, and I say that we're no different than a factory worker, because we also need to be, whether it's reskilled, upskilled, we need a different set of skills. Can you talk to that for a second?
Yeah, there's that line about the cobbler's kids doesn't have shoes, right? So, and we are seeing more and more. HR is so focused on taking care of other people and developing other people and responding to our other employees' needs that we don't stop and pause and say, we too need professional development. The HR that you learned 20 years ago is not the HR of today. And so we don't pour into ourselves. We don't invest in ourselves. You're busy trying to figure out what course to send someone else to. And you don't pause and say, maybe I need to go to Ron Thomas's training so that I can become a more 21st century HR practitioner. So what are we seeing? Number one, and I mentioned it in the beginning, is flexibility and agility. Our profession has been known as not being particularly flexible. We were rules and compliance related and all of that.
Police.
Police. And we move slowly. And not everyone, let me be clear. If you're out there, and I know you're in the Facebook Live world and you said, not me, perhaps not, but a lot of your colleagues are. And so number one is we've got to build that muscle that allows us to be more flexible, not so rules-based. You need some rules, but not everything. When you walk into, just anecdotally, and joined an organization and the handbook was like 200 pages long. And I said, who wrote this? Like, first of all, no one's going to read it. And the lawyer in me, I'm trained as a labor and employment lawyer, if y'all don't know, I would go into court all day and say, there's no way the person understood. When they signed off on the handbook, they didn't understand it because it was 200 pages. It was too much information. So yeah, they provided it. The company provided the list of set of rules in a 200-page book. And yes, the person signed off on it during their orientation, but it's because it's so voluminous and because it's so detailed, there's no way the person knew what they were doing. So no, they don't have actual notice. Those are the sorts of things. So flexibility, agility. The other thing, big skill set that we've got to really embrace is big data. Using data to inform our decisions, both policy and practice decisions. And in HR, I joked, a lot of times you talk to HR professionals and they'll tell you, I joined this profession because I don't like math, or I don't like statistics, I don't like data.
I've heard that before.
Right? You've heard it all before. Well, that's different. You've got to. And so the positions that never existed before, I've seen 2,500 person companies have 5 or 6 analytics people on your team. That's a brand new role. So while you don't have to become a people analytics expert or a big data expert, but you've got to understand as an HR practitioner what that's all about. So that's the second. And then the final thing is really from an HR perspective, we've got to get ourselves grounded in culture. What is culture? We, soft word that we all talked about back in the day, but CEOs are getting more and more serious about culture. And we have got to figure out how to influence it such that people want to work with us.
Yeah, that's a good point, because the culture, the big C word. But if you were to ask 10 different people, you'll get 10 different definitions of it.
That's right.
So if HR is the so-called people expert, we should have a definitive understanding of what culture is and how do we drive that.
That's right.
What I tend to find, and it really bothers me, is someone will post online, we're trying to develop culture. Can you tell me what you're using? Or can you give me best practice? And I'm saying that's what worked there won't work here, possibly. Why don't you go to the source, ask your people, get insight from them, audience.
Yes.
And then you design a solution around that. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
But what I'm saying is that I think from our side, the HR side, we've got to be a little more of a diagnostician in trying to understand problems, as opposed to hearing a problem and right away we got a solution and list the best practices that we got offline.
I love that diagnostician role. I sometimes say practice consultative HR, as opposed, same thing as the idea. It's very unique. It's funny that you mentioned that. So right after, 6 weeks into COVID as we knew it, our big day in the United States was Friday March 13th, when we all came to the realization that we were going to largely shut down, except essential workers, right? So we were sending people home. And then, 6 weeks after that, a group of CEOs, namely Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Square and Twitter, came out and said, hey, everyone's going to be able to work from home permanently now. And you saw this group of other CEOs, like herd mentality, following in, and HR people jumping on and saying, yeah, that's the way of the new world. And I said, maybe that works at Twitter, but it doesn't work in your organization. You're not in touch with your culture. So we sometimes get caught up in sort of the shiniest new nickel and, that's provocative. That's who we're going to be. And you make a really good point about diagnosing. One of the things that I have struggled with as I've observed companies sort of struggle with culture is they put beautiful words like, here are our values, here are our guiding principles. And then when you talk to the employees are like, not here. That's not where I work. The senior management team, along with HR, will come in and say, this is who we want to be, which is more aspirational than who you are. When you are recruiting people, you should be able to tell them, this is how things work around here, for good or for bad. And it's not good or wrong. I mean, it might, if someone says, and we're learning this in remote work, the research will tell you 1/3 of employees report that they are more productive working remotely or working from home. Another 1/3, and it literally plays out this way, another 1/3 say about the same. But yet there's another 1/3 of your employee base who report to us, I don't do well at home. I need the social interaction. So if you jump out as an HR leader and say, see, Twitter's doing it, and so therefore we should do it without, as you said, diagnosing the issue, talking with your employees and having them tell you, because the culture is what it is, and you need to be clear about that. So wrapping this up, it's you can't underestimate. We sometimes, and again, I'm not being destructively critical, I'm being constructively critical. Our profession, you want the shortcut. To your point, tell me, Ron, what do I do to solve for culture? Well, it is a very unique exercise. And if you think you can go pull it off the shelf, you could fall into, by luck, the right answer, but more likely than not, your efforts are going to fail. And your business leader is going to look at you and say, listen, we spent money, we listened to you, we did what you said, and you were wrong. And it's because of this shortcut mentality to pull it off the shelf.
Yeah. And, I read a quote, and I tend to use it quite a bit. Einstein said, if you had an hour to solve a problem, you take 55 minutes to understand the problem. And in 5 minutes, you solve it. But we will take it and we go to the 5-minute side, and right away, we're looking to come up with a solution. And I belong to Facebook HR groups across the globe. And I sit and monitor sometimes the conversation, and it's kind of like you're so far off bullseye. I mean, you're not even anywhere near the target, as to what HR looks like in this new dynamic, and the process piece, and concentrating on the process, making sure we get the payroll out on time, making sure that we're punishing people. My first foray into global was in Saudi Arabia. And you talk about a policy manual. I came across a penalties manual. It was a manual this thick, that for every infraction, here was the so-called repercussions that was going to happen if you were to infringe upon number A. Here's 2 things that were going to happen. And my thought was, who wrote this? Who had the time to sit down and run through these scenarios and come up with these solutions? Because it was basically just wasted talent.
And no wonder people had negative impressions of HR. I mean,
exactly.
Therein lies the problem. Now, we've made a lot of progress across the globe. So the US has things they do well, Canada, the UK. I mean, the Middle East is pretty progressive, especially on reskilling and upskilling. I found that is one of their areas of strength, because from the entire country, or that part of the world, understands that as the world becomes less reliant on oil, and they've got to figure out how to reskill all of these people who have deep experience in oil. And now, what is the economy of the future? So spot on. We have such a role. There's never, ever been a time when I am more excited to be in HR. I mean, it really is. Now, it's scary because things are coming at you what you thought one day. I mean, we were talking about social unrest the other day in the United States. I'm sure your listeners know about what has occurred on our soil since May 25th, 2020, with respect to George Floyd and his death. And so we had always, this isn't new, sadly, we experience this every 3 to 5 years. They did it under the Obama administration. There was Freddie Gray, who was murdered senselessly in Baltimore, 45 minutes from Washington, D.C. So it's not something unique, but what is unique this time is that it left the streets, if you will, and came into our offices. So HR now has to respond to this, and we never had to deal with it. I mean, when Rodney King, some 30 years ago in the United States, and
I remember that,
you remember that? But it never really played out in the workforce, in the workplace. Now it's here. And so this is now an HR issue. So if you thought your plate was full at first, now you can focus on diversity, inclusion, and equity.
Yeah. That's a very good analogy, because as you said, now it's in the workplace. Because I saw a post the other day, and someone was asking about policies about wearing a mask inside of an organization.
Yeah.
And there was a flare up, and how could we put a policy around it? And I look at that from a global perspective. There is no problem with anyone. You walk outside here now, everyone has on a mask. Nobody pulls that foolishness.
That's right.
Because I give Dubai government a lot of credit, because they put a marketing campaign behind it, if I may say that. We're all in this together. So every ad you hear on the radio, on TV, we're all in this together. So they preach that. So there's never any flare-ups. There's never anybody that got to put off a plane because they don't want to wear a mask, but has gotten totally out of control, in the US. And now it's inside of the workplace. So yeah.
And
it's at your front door now.
Yeah, you have to remember, and this again is why culture is so important. You all largely, and I'm not generalizing, but Dubai has a little bit more. You just talked about it, a culture, a history of rules-based kind of thing. And so it's easier to get people to do it when they remember there are consequences in this country for doing it. The United States is by definition we're rebels, right? The Tea Party, that we broke apart from our colonial, we just have a history. So built into our DNA is a little bit of freedom. I do what I want to do. You do what's good for you. I'm going to do what's good for me. And so what we're up against from an HR perspective is Americans being Americans, right? Americans don't like to be told what to do. One of them, I'm telling you now, even after 9/11, it's amazing. You would have thought, which is our largest office in the country and protects the homeland, that people would gladly agree to go through any sorts of metal detecting and checking, but we resisted even that until this day. I mean, how long has it been since 9/11? You still have people who come in and say, I don't want you looking at mine. I don't know why I need to not carry water or bottle liquids on a plane. So it's just a lot of, I do want to put it in context for those of you all. Our history is one of rebellion.
Yeah. But it's really gotten out of control. But that's an entirely different conversation that we can have on that. So when we look back at human resources and we talked about upskilling, so Dave Aldrich came out with the HRBP model, and everybody aspired to that. And how it got out of control from my side is that they just gave people HRBP roles without having the competencies to be in that role and understanding what that role was about, because the HRBP role is not process-based for the most part. What your certification programs, what do you see is probably, if we had to build another HRBP for a 3.0 version, 2.0 version, or whatever it is, what would it look like?
So the fundamentals of HR haven't changed, and I like to separate it. So there are, if you look at Maslow's sort of theory of, people self-actualizing, at the base of that triangle, you've got to do the care and feeding. People need, they need their pay, they need health benefits, however offered either through the government or in some cases through employers. You need the basics of HR. And sometimes I think we can get so caught up in needing and wanting to be strategic that we forget that the trains do have to run on time. So fundamentally, I never want to get away from ensuring that people come to work and they want to be paid and they want to be treated right. And but then you got to, what happened is we stopped at that, providing the basic physiological needs of an employee. And so now we're going up toward this self-actualization and getting the most out of our investment in people. And we're having to, as an HR profession, start to think about other things, like how do you ensure, and this is a really big one because I've alluded to reskilling and upskilling, how do you ensure that Johnny, who graduates college, if he goes to college, and by the way, we're now increasingly saying all these jobs don't require college, but what is the training that will make him relevant? Not to retire in 30 years with a gold watch, but we're living and working for 40, 50 years now. So HR professionals are having to rethink the paradigm, and then succession planning. How does that work? I can give you a specific example because I want to talk about this is really important. When people are living until comfortably their 80s, they're not retiring at 65. I mean, the new retirement age is more like 75, which means, what do you do for the people who want their next promotion if the guy or woman in that senior level position you want isn't going anywhere? You are now facing the reality as an HR team that your people are frustrated because their careers, they don't see the career trajectory. This guy isn't leaving until 75, I'm 40, he's 60. So he's got 15 more years. I got to sit around until then. So those are the sorts of things. It's a lot of how do you keep people engaged? That's in 3.0. It's like, how do you help people remain interested and engaged in work in the 21st century. And the final thing is things change so much. There are paradigm shifts now every 3 to 5 years. Remember, when you really think about work, work was work as we know it. For example, there's something called the Fair Labor Standards Act. It was written in 1938. We didn't make any significant changes to our work laws. I mean, we made some amendments here and there, but by and large, we have defined work as it was in 1940.
Wow.
Right? And that was good for probably 40 years. But in the last 20 or 30 years, the paradigm shifts have occurred so drastically, and HR hasn't caught up. That's what 3.0 is about. It's about rethinking who is an employee versus an independent contractor. All of those issues, no one had to think about whether or not an Uber driver was an employee or an independent contractor, because 10 years ago, there was no Uber. Right? So HR is having to respond to that. And where it was most pronounced, and I'm going to be quiet after this, but I get excited about this topic.
It's okay.
After the pandemic hit, and it put a number of these independent, outside of the formal sector of work, we put those people out of work. So an Uber driver, if you were a driver on my staff, you were entitled to unemployment benefits if I laid you off. Right. If you were an Uber driver, there's no safety net. When people stopped traveling and going to work, you became unemployed. And so for the first time in our history, we had to provide unemployment benefits to people who were never employed. That's because we had a 1938 construct of what a worker is, what an employee is, and not a 2021. So all of that's going to come down the pike, and that's the next phase in 3.0, is how to think differently about work, the worker, and the workplace.
Okay, that law that you spoke about, is that being looked at to be rewritten? Because I know there was a case in California, I think it was, concerning Uber, the classification status of an Uber driver. But from a U.S. law perspective, is that being relooked at? Because I'm thinking a lot, since you mentioned, I'm thinking a lot of the labor laws that were written in a different time zone are going to have to be revisited, with work from anywhere, work from home. I noticed this morning Dubai is advertising across the globe. If you're on a work from anywhere, you can get a visa to come and live here and work in the U.S., Switzerland, or whatever it is. The Bahamas, the Caribbean is doing the same thing.
Who'd have thunk? Right?
Yeah.
This is your point spot. This is not something I would have envisioned. And again, thinking I'm a futurist, 5 years ago, I would have said there's no way that's a possibility. Yeah. And then, 3 years ago, but then COVID happened. And it has literally transformed. So yes, that law is dated. It was already being challenged, as you pointed out. California, before the pandemic, was questioning whether or not the COVID was, whether or not drivers were actually employees or whatever. But yeah, all in all, SHRM has been working. We have a government affairs team.
Okay.
And we're working with our Department of Labor and departments of labor around the world. I work with the International Labor Organization, ILO, and we spend a lot of time trying to figure out what do the new policies need to be for the employment, for the workplace. And it's so different than any of us could even imagine, until even people like you and I, who are pretty aggressive about these things, we can't help but think about the way it was. So there are legacy ties to this. And we almost have to get our elected officials to, and that's what we're trying to do, is influence them to say, this is the way it's going to be in the 21st century.
Yeah. So if we look at probably future putting new laws on the book, do you think it's going to be, because of COVID and the number of people that have been impacted with evictions, loss of jobs, not even a standard wage, or all these other kind of repercussions that came up as a result, do you think these new laws should be more centered towards employee-centric versus organizational-centric? So
that's a really interesting one, and I'm gonna dodge it a little bit because that was unfair.
Navigate. I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I said I had to ask it.
Well, it's the question we are asked all the time as HR practitioners: do you represent management or the employees? And the answer is both. And here's it: you must take into consideration management's perspective, because they're paying for you. If you think about it, If I buy something, then I have a right to say what I want that something to, how it operates. The flip side is if I'm the employer, I am selling my services and I want to make sure that I'm appropriately compensated, and that I get a fair shake for the exchange. It needs to be mutually beneficial. And that's what HR is. And we struggle a lot with trying to walk that line. It is tough. It is tough to figure out, because oftentimes when it comes down to a decision, ultimately the employer and management will make it. They are the people spending the money for you to provide. And as horrible as it may make some people feel, you have choices. You work here or you don't. And let me tell you, COVID has really proved interesting, because 7-8 months ago, we in the States had 3.5% unemployment. Now we're double that, more than double that, which means where we were in a seller's market, the employee could demand X, Y, and Z. We're now in a buyer's market, and employers are laying off. Disney just announced 28,000 people there.
I saw that,
Airlines are laying off, and I'm sure this is happening in Dubai as well.
Yeah.
Not at the same degree, but unemployment globally. Last night I was on a line with the CEO of the Australian HR organization, Ari, and she was just saying, I mean, our unemployment has gone through the roof, and employers, the shift from who's in control, the seller, formerly the employee, and the employer, has occurred. And it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out.
Yeah, it really is going to be interesting. So as we're going through post-COVID and trying to get back on track, I read an interesting article a while back that said and you mentioned in an earlier conversation, the 2008 disaster was basically structural for the most part, because it came back. The people that brought it back were financial people. CFOs played a huge role in doing that. But from the inside of the organization, you think of the HR, this is a people issue.
That's right.
Work rules and models and all these kinds of things. What I fear and what I hear when I get a call from a CEO is that my team is not capable of doing that. My CHRO is not capable of doing that. Can you give us some help, and can you work with her, him, whoever, to try and get us back on track?
Well, so it's the blessing and the curse. You're right. 2008 was an economic crisis, and therefore, and I often say this, what Y2K did for technology, and what the 2008 financial debacle and crisis did for CFOs and financial professionals is what the pandemic has done for HR professionals. It has given us this platform to say what we do really matters. And I got to tell you, as I said, I've never been more excited about being in the profession. The downside is management who in the past kind of tolerated average, mediocre HR professionals, because they have concluded this is so important that I can't just have anyone in this job. And I can't tell you, Ron, I get more calls from HR people who are now unemployed, where their CEO or their boss literally said, you're not good enough anymore. And it's not that you changed, it's that their expectations for professionals in the space have changed, because it really is our moment. It's the blessing, which is now you no longer have to ask for the seat at the table. I was talking to a CEO of a financial services company, a big one, and he said to me earlier on in the pandemic, he said, I have talked more with my CHRO in the last 8 weeks than I have the prior 8 years.
Exactly.
8 years. And so, like you said, we're seeing a lot of HR people now, they're being tested by management, because management says what you do is so critical. And a lot of folks aren't cutting it. They're just not making the cut.
Yeah, I saw a stat the other day concerning CHRO turnover.
Yes.
And it was trending higher. And they're projecting that when it goes into pre-COVID, COVID, post-COVID, it's going to double.
It is.
Because of the same scenario that you talked about.
We are. I sit on something called the American Workforce Policy Advisory Board, which was President Trump appointed a big board, and it includes all CEOs and some academics, but largely CEOs. Tim Cook from Apple is on the board. Jenny Rometty, chairwoman of the IBM's board, former CEO. Lockheed Martin. The who's who of CEOs sitting around the table, and I'm fortunate to be a member of that august group of 25 people. But I got to tell you, out of that, the number of times they've come to me and they're talking about people, HR, and work. And you can't think of this occurring 10 years ago, there wouldn't be a White House convening. And I'm not talking about a one-time convening. We meet quarterly and for hours at a time. And we went to Camp David. And so you've got business leaders for the first time saying, I'm not sure I have the HR that I should have. And so wow. And I mean, telling you straight to your face. So it's fun. It's a good time to, but it's scary for people who have not reskilled themselves. Back to your earlier point, which is we're so busy upskilling and reskilling everyone else, and we don't take enough time to work on our own professional development.
Yeah, exactly. And we definitely are going to have to do that. So there's a quote that it's the best of times and the worst of times. Yep. So when the metaphor you just used, that's mine. Yes. Because we're going to have to, it's in our court now.
Yeah.
And we have to step up to the plate. But what I find scary is that I talk to a lot of CHROs, I talk to a lot of CEOs, and they're saying, I need help.
Yes.
And they're coming to me, I need help and guidance. And I said, sure, we could talk about it, but it's not free. For my side, I'll go through a little coaching and up beyond that, but this is what I do for a living. But you're right, so it's come to that point. So you mentioned the group that you're a part of, and that's gonna take us into the current administration, the president, a lot of rumblings in US concerning that. Give us your overview of Trump relation to employers, SHRM, your roles. Walk us through that, because there's been talk. Walk us through that.
Yeah, so listen, the one thing that I make clear up front is that SHRM is not bipartisan, we're nonpartisan. And a lot of your listeners may not be in the US, so let me kind of quickly put a little bit of context around that. Partisan, we have primarily two parties. There's technically a third or fourth party, but they're really Democrats and Republicans in the United States. Yeah. And as the world sees right now, it's a bitter fight. And by the way, this happens all over the world, and every country has elections, and they can become acrimonious and ugly and all of that, but you heal and get back together and your country goes. So one person's gonna win, one person's gonna lose. But I'm gonna do one more big, quick civics lesson for people, at least on US, how it works in our country. So you have three branches of government. The judicial branch, obviously, the judges, right? You have the legislative branch, which is our Congress, which is made up of Senate and House of Representatives. And then you have the executive branch, which is the White House. Okay. What we have to do in this two-party system that overlays all of that at SHRM is to influence workplace policy, no matter who is in control. So, we early on, and people forget, I was a big bundler and supporter of Hillary Clinton. I am now a Trump appointee on this American Workforce Policy Advisory Board and am his advisor on historically Black colleges and universities. I'm an American, I'm a patriot. SHRM's position is to say whoever is in the office, because they could be there for 4 years or they could be there for 8 years, and they could be replaced by their vice president. And therefore this could go on and on and on. We've seen it happen before. Our job is to ensure that we take principled, research, evidence-based decisions, and we use that to inform the policymakers so that they come out with the best policy. It may not be perfect, but the best policy that they can introduce as law in our country. So, right now the temptation, and we see it, I'm telling you, I know some of you say, I don't like the president. Well, this isn't about liking the president or not. This is about force policy. This is all it's about. And you cannot, if you are a member of SHRM or of any global HR organization, and remember, we have members in 165 countries. When I'm in Dubai, as you know, we have offices there. SHRM has a presence there. We have 3 offices in India. I can't It's not about one person or their administration. We have to come up with a strategy, which we have. We've articulated the areas of focus, and we are delivering on those irrespective of who's there. That's tough in a world that is as divided as we are. It's really sad. We as a country, in particular, I can speak critically of the United States on this, we have an empathy deficit. Everybody, everyone says they want diversity, but what they really mean is diversity as long as I agree with it. They don't really mean diversity. And we at SHRM absolutely embrace diversity. We believe it makes us better. And that means if I'm a Democrat, I have to respect and embrace that a Republican, and vice versa, or an independent, or a Black person, or a white person, or a man, or a woman, or a straight person, or gay. Like, this is the way it works. So I want to sit it there for anyone listening. We have this system that says the courts, the legislative body, our Congress, and our administration, and sometimes they clash, but it doesn't matter to us who the president is. As an organization, we got to make sure that whomever it is, that they carry out and do and make good employment policy.
Okay. Yeah, you're good. You're good, because it would be tough for me to be in your spot, in that role and trying to play, straddle that. So you do a great.
Can I say this? You're really not straddling. And so I've had a lot of people say, well, Johnny, I don't know how you straddle. I don't straddle.
Okay.
We come into a meeting and we say, for example, SHRM believes that we as a country, and I think globally, some countries have already done it, need to figure out how to provide paid leave for people who are truly sick. The pandemic has highlighted that people who were sick in the past but were only given 5 days, and therefore if you're sick for 10, you lose money, they came to work and exposed other people. So our position all along is we need to figure out how to provide paid leave, reasonable period of time for employees. I come in there, there's a saying, and I'm going to paraphrase it, and I think it's Frederick Douglass who said, and if you don't know, Frederick Douglass, famous American abolitionist, etc., but I think he said, I will join up with anyone to do good and no one to do bad. And anyone means anyone. It's just like, I don't even think about who the person is across the table. I think about the position they hold and their ability to influence policy.
Okay, the outcome.
That's right.
Yeah, okay, cool. You mentioned diversity. I had on Torrin Ellis, which I'm sure you know, Torrin. Yeah. I had him on the other week, and we were talking about diversity in light of Floyd and all the companies coming out with the long letters, and we're committed, and we're this, and we're that. And I'm doing kind of a side eye to it.
Me and you both, right?
Right. So, because my thing was my first job out of college, and the only reason I got that job at IBM because they had a big push on affirmative action.
Right.
And I got my job because of affirmative action, because when I came out of school, you were either going to sell insurance or teach school. That was it. You had no other options. And so I see these long pieces coming out, and my reaction is, okay, the public relations people did a great job, but are you living that inside? You talked about mission, core values, and all the, when you read some of these websites and you go through, the wording is kind of like you could just put a violin to it because it's beautiful words. But you go inside and ask people, it's opposites. Talk us through SHRM's diversity, equality, inclusion. All the words are coming up now, and everybody's feeling good and talking. And what is it going to mean 3 years from now? Will anything change? Because the other thing, and then I'll turn it back over to you, is that when I saw these letters, I immediately clicked over to their website. I clicked over to About and looked at their leadership team, and there was nothing there. There was no people that looked like me or mine.
Right.
But meanwhile, there was this big piece.
Well, that's you nailed a pet peeve of mine, right?
Yeah.
Don't tell me that you love me. Show me that you love me. And I have been in this game long enough to know that I actually roll my eyes when I see these platitudes.
The side eye.
And I'm like, really? And we believe in diversity. Well, I look at your website, I can't tell from your board, I can't tell from your senior management, I can't tell that you believe in diversity. And I've been pretty vocal in calling out some companies, listen, Nike, for all that it is, this global brand that you all are aware of, they jumped out and took a lead on this and supported Kaepernick and all of this on it. but then go look and see, do they have any direct reports to the CEO who are Black? No.
Yeah.
And so
which is their big market.
Right. And listen, they have, I mean, at the end of the day, and maybe they are about to appoint once or recently, but let's say as of 2 weeks ago, they didn't. And so I struggle with this disconnect where there's a crisis. And many of these organizations, to your point, are never ones to miss a good crisis, right? To take advantage.
Yeah.
They jump on and they are monetizing it and they're shoring up their employment brand. But we in HR advocate for living your values, not just posting your values. We talked about this earlier when we talked about culture. It's not enough to say we're a good culture when people who work there say, no, you aren't. And there's a disconnect. And we have to become committed as a profession to holding our organizations accountable, not in a punitive way necessarily, but to say, listen, if you say this is who you are, let's be this person or this organization. Mm-hmm. I am hoping that this does not, again, pardon me for being cynical, but I'm the guy who saw every time the country literally catches on fire because people are rioting or protesting, these companies come out and say the right things and commit to spending tens of millions of dollars and billions of dollars. And then you wake up 3-5 years later and you say, I can't tell that you were really committed to it. My hope, and I am also the optimist, so there's a little bit of me that's absolutely a cynic, but the optimist in me says something is palpably different right now. Maybe it's because this happened at the same time that you had COVID. And, so maybe that combination will make this stick. And 3, 4, 5 years from now, when we look back, we'll say, no, there was an appreciable difference. Things are different now when it comes to diversity, inclusion, and equity. Let me say one other thing real quick, because I know we're wrapping up, is it's not just about Black people, diversity. There are 20 or more dimensions of diversity, and they range the course. You've got civil rights kind of diversity, you have, which is race and gender and national origin and age, and then you have political thought, people who are affiliated with different, there's just so many different forms of diversity. And what I believe is that if we practice and figure out the methodology for making diversity a part of our culture when it comes to racial equity, then that will apply to gender and the other organizations. We essentially have to get organizations prepared to really be the diverse companies that they talk about.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned when we started out, about everything that's going on inside the workplace, you're coming in, you're stressed out over this. A lot of talk today about wellness and burnout. And has SHRM done any research around wellness and burnout and what we would need going forward as we build out a people strategy?
Yeah, we have.
And the role that wellness and all of those type things will play into that.
And so, yes, I'm glad you mentioned wellness, because it's not only physical wellness. A lot of times when we thought about that, we were talking about gym memberships and keeping your blood pressure, your sugar count down for diabetes, et cetera. But now COVID has really highlighted mental health. And it's a big opportunity. We know right now that 1 in 4, SHRM conducted some research, 1 in 4 American workers have reported that they are depressed, down, and often, not periodically. We all have a bad day, right? But I'm talking about consistently down. So this is another opportunity where HR is going to have to look critically at its employee assistance programs and make sure that they're high quality, and that, just as you want a high quality doctor, you want a high quality mental health counselor, because you need both of those to truly be well. And so we're doing a lot of research, talking with employees, understanding, we know there's a stigma associated with mental health issues. And so we want to do what we can do to bring that down, launching some interesting products in 2021 and partnerships with organizations to help destigmatize mental health. That's one, but not forgetting that physical health matters too. Listen, we have people now, if you're working from home, you used to work out in the gym or at your office, or on your way back from the office, you stopped at a gym, and now you're in your house, these closed doors. And for a while, people were told to stay at home. In fact, we had a huge campaign here in Washington, D.C., stay home. Well, what that led to is people's physical health deteriorating as well as their mental health deteriorating because they weren't exercising. So HR plays a huge role. If you want someone to come to work and do their best and deliver you an amazing return on your investment, they need to be well.
Yeah, yeah, that's wellness is all, it's, I don't want to say it's the new buzzword, the other word is agility. We hear agility, all those kinds of things, but this is real, because people were locked down and stressed out completely. What
Suicide
advice?
rates are up, divorce rates are up, alcoholism is up. All of these things are up right now. And so we do, and in a pronounced way.
I shouldn't laugh about this, but I read an article from the head of the Association of Divorce Lawyers here in the Middle East, and there was an uptick in inquiries coming into their offices.
Listen, living with that person all day makes you say, "Now."
We shouldn't laugh about it, but I'm saying that's an interesting side note.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. So, in closing, what advice would you give to you're as they would say down south, you're in a tall cotton. That's a euphemism in the South that you're in a different strata.
Good.
From the CHRO, what advice would you give CHROs in their new challenge role to prepare for post?
Yeah, and this is going to sound pretty maybe provocative, but throw out everything that you've learned. The rules are so different now that everything that you kind of relied on and you assumed to be truth when it comes to HR practice have changed. We were already seeing the change, HR leaders. When you think about, we have 5 generations in the workplace right now. So also managing several different generations who think differently. But every bit of your practice needs to be revisited. Everything that you think needs to be revisited, and then develop a new strategy. Some of that may come with you, but I would suggest to you and submit to you, and I've been doing this myself, a lot of what I assume to be truth from a practice standpoint is no longer true. And the only way you're going to be effective in your role going forward is if you're willing to really pull the Band-Aid off and say, okay, was it right? And if you need to put some antibiotic, that's where we are right now. So I am challenging myself, and I'm no different than anyone else. I'm a creature of habit, right? But I think I have the added advantage of being a lawyer. Trained as a lawyer, the laws that existed when I finished law school don't largely now, right? Or they've been amended, or the courts have responded to. So I'm forced to maintain my relevancy and to achieve time. People oftentimes think HR is more static, and they're wrong. And the pandemic has led us to just totally rethink everything from remote work to benefits to, you name it, pay, all of that is now on the table. So my short advice is, at the end of the day, take the exercise of revisiting everything you do in your practice. And you may carry some of it forward, but I suggest to you that a lot of it is going to be different. Yeah.
You know what? That sinks in directly with the advice that I give. Everything should be looked at it in light of disruption, because you're going to have to revisit it, because what worked at a different time zone is not going to work now. Let's take it one more side, and then we'll close it out. From the C-suite, what would you advise senior level people that are listening in? We've talked about leadership competencies, how they've changed. What advice would you give to the C-suite in talking about reimagining the workforce? So we've given HR advice. What advice would you have for the C-suite as our last question?
2 things. One, I would say, make sure you have the right HR person and the right HR team. Culture really matters. Then the nurturers and the keepers of culture, your HR function, have to be best in class. And it's not who was best in class, it is who is currently best in class. And that scares us, because that means I'm actually asking the C-suite to question whether or not they have the right person. Well, listen, to use a sports analogy, you can be traded. You want the best person. The goal is about winning, right? And for me, I take that as a welcome challenge. That's number one. The second thing is to really, really, really focus on culture. That takes the E-team. The HR person can't create the culture. They should help facilitate the identification and the codification of culture and nurturing of it. But it takes the entire C-suite to sit down and say, who are we? What is our culture? And then secondarily, what do we aspire to be from sort of our future state from a culture standpoint? If you don't have that real in-depth conversation and thought process, then I don't know how you're going to operate your business, because you really have got to be clear about who you are and give that, and then HR will help communicate it. It will recruit against it, because there's no point in recruiting people who don't fit in your culture. And I'm not talking about who's of a different race, aged. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking cultural alignment, the way that you all see the world and how you operate, how things really get done. So those are the two pieces of advice I would give every business leader. Is one, make sure you have strong HR. You owe it to yourself to have the best HR team if you want to win. And then once you, and maybe, I don't know if the order is necessarily this, but really take a deep look into who your what does it mean to work at your shop? What is your culture? And then align to that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. Johnny, thank you so much for taking time and coming on and enlightening the audience. This has been a real treat, because as we said, HR is in the driver's seat, and who more so in the driver's seat than guiding the profession than the president and CEO of Society of Human Resource Management. Thank you so much.
Okay, my friend. Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Okay.